June 27, 1880, Helen Keller was born into a loving family in Tuscumbia, Alabama. She played, giggled, and cried like all children do, but that would not last long. Just 2 years later, Helen was struck down with an illness that changed the course of her life. Left blind and deaf, Helen Keller became frustrated, restless, and angry. When she was unable to eloquently express herself, she would throw temper tantrums and scream at the top of her lungs. When Helen was 7, her parents hired a teacher so that she could learn to communicate. Anne Sullivan taught Helen the hand alphabet and spelled things into her palm, but there was no context for the words and Helen just thought of it as a fun game. That is until one day when Miss Sullivan walked Helen to a water pump and put water in her hand. She then spelled water into Helen's palm. Helen Keller realized that the wonderful, life-giving liquid flowing between her fingers was in fact water. This is the story that most people know about Helen Keller. She is a woman immortalized in history as the child who was taught to read and communicate by a miracle worker. Most people don't know that she was a pacifist and a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, otherwise known as the IWW or the Wobblies, and that she fought vigorously against the United States' entry into World War I, at a time when she felt like the government completely neglected the well-being of America's workers. Her influential nature made her a very effective advocate for peace, and her determination to speak for those who couldn't drove her to become a co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU. Helen Keller was a hard-working, compassionate member of the ACLU, constantly expressing her opinions in speeches and articles. Even though Helen Keller has passed away, the ACLU continues to protect the constitutional rights of Americans. Helen Keller's radical opinions formed when, in 1906, she was asked to research the conditions of the blind. She had initially assumed blindness was a terrible occurrence that was out of anyone's control, but she was horrified to find that many times blindness was caused by bad working conditions that could be easily avoided if employers weren't so greedy. Helen Keller knew firsthand how difficult it was to be blind, but she knew that her blindness wasn't anyone's fault. The fact that someone could steal another's sight for their own selfish reasons and yet remain unpunished because of their obscene amount of power angered Helen. To try and combat the unfairness, Helen Keller joined the Socialist Party in 1909. Many people believe that Helen Keller was manipulated by Ms. Sullivan's husband at the time, John Albert Macy, who is also a socialist. Because the stigma attached to the word socialist limited the effectiveness of the party, Helen Keller found it too slow-moving. So in 1912, she joined the Industrial Workers of the World, an organization that fought for decent working conditions and pay by organizing public protests. Helen Keller did her part too, writing compelling articles about the injustice of power-hungry capitalists riding on the backs of working-class families. "A shame to my very soul I behold in my beloved Southland the tears of those oppressed, those who bring their sons and daughters to bondage to be servants because others have their fields and vineyards. And on the side of the oppressor is power." Not all reactions to her articles were positive. Some people would praise her for working through her disabilities and then turn around and claim that she thought the way she did because she was ignorant due to the same disabilities. For example, the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle wrote that her mistakes sprung out of the manifest limitations of her development. Yet he would write positively about the same limitations that she was able to overcome and then use as an advantage to get her word out to the world about the plight of the disabled. Other newspapers thought the same thing of her controversial opinions, and soon very few would publish her articles. Left with no other options, Helen was forced to give speeches. Unfortunately, Helen Keller could not speak clearly, so she needed an interpreter, which may have lessened the impact of her messages. Not being able to speak naturally was Helen Keller's only regret. But even with these setbacks, Helen Keller persevered, defying the media's efforts to paint her as an angelic girl holding a braille book and sniffing a rose. When the United States prepared to enter World War I, Helen began working harder for the rights of workers. She saw the war as just another way for capitalists to control their workers for their own personal gain. In 1916, Helen Keller gave a speech entitled "Strike Against War," where she told the audience that Congress is not preparing to defend the people of the United States. It is planning to protect the capital of American speculators and investors in Mexico, South America, China, and the Philippine Islands. Incidentally, this preparation will benefit the manufacturers of munitions and war machines. She spoke about how the war was not necessary and was fought to protect America's assets while spilling the blood of thousands of American soldiers in the process. At the end of her speech, Helen Keller called the audience to action by exclaiming, "It is your duty to insist upon still more radical measure. It is your business to see that no child is employed in an industrial establishment or mine or store, and that no worker is needlessly exposed to accident or disease. It is your business to make them give you clean cities, free from smoke, dirt, and congestion. It is your business to make them pay you a living wage. It is your business to see that this kind of preparedness is carried into every department on the nation, until everyone has a chance to be well-born, well-nourished, rightly educated, intelligent, and serviceable to the country at all times," implying that the war didn't matter until the U.S. could fix its own problems. In 1917, the Espionage Act was enacted, punishing citizens with prison sentences and heavy fines for doing vaguely anti-war activities. Because at the time the U.S. government found it difficult to differentiate between radical labor, socialism, opposition to war, and alien enemies, it was no surprise that 101 defendants went on trial in April 1918, including the IWW head Big Bill Haywood. Altogether, the defendants were fined $2.5 million, practically destroying the IWW. It was not in Helen Keller's character to stand by and let such an injustice occur. She needed to do something about it.
She was absolutely unstoppable, and she was a fantastic debater. She read an enormous amount as a young woman and throughout her life, and she had integrity, which she went down in history as an important person because she had this, not just charisma, but she was believable. She had the integrity that it takes to really lead a movement, and she was also an extraordinarily hard worker.
She would not be idle as her freedom of speech was taken away because of an act which threatened to punish anyone who spoke out. Others agreed. In 1920, the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, formed to protect the freedom of speech of World War I protesters. The organization quickly expanded its focus to include the rights of workers, artists, and ethnic minorities. Helen Keller was on the original National Committee of the ACLU, along with many other important reformists of her time. Helen Keller charmed the public and used her talent for writing to advocate for the ACLU. Even after World War I, there was still a need for the organization. During World War II, when the United States forced Americans of Japanese descent to be held against their will in war relocation camps, the ACLU spoke out to stop this injustice. In this generation, discrimination is becoming less obvious, but it is still there. The ACLU fights against attacks on marriage fairness for LGBT couples, efforts to deny women insurance for abortion care, people and organizations that use religion as a basis to discriminate or deny services, old-fashioned gender stereotypes and sex segregation in the classroom, making it difficult for the poor to vote, anti-immigration laws that promote racism, and racist disciplinary practices that take children of ethnic minorities out of schools and introduce them into the criminal justice system. Because of her handicaps, it would have been much easier for Helen Keller to live a simple life in Alabama, and no one would have blamed her for it. Instead, she constantly worked towards her ideals and fought for the people of America who were left behind. Helen ignored her opposition and worked countless hours to fight against the U.S.'s entry into World War I. Even though she was unable to prevent the U.S.'s entry into the war, with the help of other reformers, she helped create the ACLU to protect the free speech of anti-war protesters. The American Civil Liberties Union still exists today, protecting the rights of all Americans and preserving the ideas that Helen Keller stood for. Helen Keller once said, "Some of us have imagined that we live in a democracy. We do not. The democracy would mean full opportunity for all. It would mean that every child had a chance to be well-fed, well-educated, and properly started in life. It would mean that every human being had a voice in the making of laws and in exercising its privileges. It would mean that all men enjoyed the fruits of their labor. Such a democracy has never existed." That may be true, but thanks to Helen Keller, we are a little closer to that ideal.